Greetings from Shanghai. My name is Carolina Ballester and I'm International Program Manager for the Shanghai International Children's Book Fair, which takes place every November in Shanghai since 2013. The objective of this video is to give you an overview of the recent developments that have been taking place in China in the field of picture book illustration. And I would like to focus especially in the generation of youngest illustrators whose work I have discovered recently through their participation in the illustration contest we organize at the book fair, the Golden Pinwheel Young Illustrators Competition. First of all, let me take you to China, a country where all of you know change occurs with fascinating speed and determination. About 15 years ago, China developed a strong enthusiasm for picture books. It started with Chinese publishers acquiring the translation rights of foreign titles, especially those from the US, the UK, France, or Japan. Rapidly, this massive import of foreign picture books set the ground for a consumer's market for picture books, and it also unveiled a growing readership made of young parents who want innovation and quality for their children's education. Similar phenomenon had occurred in other countries in Asia in the past, namely in Japan in the decade of the 70s and the 80s, or in Korea a bit later in the 90s. It's now China's turn to discover modern picture books. But if we look on what happened in those other Asian countries, they progressively switched from being consumers of foreign picture books to boasting a domestic original production of their own, thanks to the emergence of talented picture book creators. Will we witness a similar revolution in China? Well, chances are the process has already started. China sits on a wonderful tradition of text illustration. If you visited Bologna in the spring of 2018, you might remember the special exhibition on Chinese ancient illustration that was held at the City Hall. It showed original copies of illustrated editions of Red literary classics like Journey to the West, Dream of the Red Chamber, or The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. You might also have seen one time mid-20th century comic books from China, which are characterized by their long horizontal formats. They were cheap entertainment publications read by adults and youngsters alike. But if we want to look back on the evolution of Chinese contemporary illustrator, let's start simply in the late 1970s. 1979 marks the beginning of the opening reforms, which led the Chinese economy to evolve towards more market-oriented activities. This implies important changes in the publishing industry too. Back then, right in the beginning, the children's book market was very traditional. The books produced focused mostly on literary classics or didactical publications, educational books, textbooks. The overall quality was low and books were very cheap. In such context, illustrators were merely instrumental, and written text what seemed to really matter in books for children. Many of the illustrators who were working at that time were also editors or art directors for children's magazines or educational publishing houses. Sometimes they would also teach art at university.
Among this first generation of modern illustrators, some pioneers have set the first milestones for important changes. Thanks to their patient work, illustration started being seen as a fully artistic language. But also, they were the first artists in gaining international recognition, sometimes more than 20 years after they had started publishing. One of those pioneering artists is Tao Gao. Born in 1946 in the central province of Hunan, Tao Gao is probably one of the oldest illustrators still in activity. She was also the first Chinese artist to be prized in the Biennale of Illustration of Bratislava as early as in 1993. She was trained as a painter using mostly oil and acrylics, and this background reflects quite clearly in her illustration. She treats mostly Chinese classical themes, but depicts them with a singular impressionist touch that makes her style very easily recognizable. Many are the Chinese illustrators who quote her as a solid source of inspiration. Born in Shanghai in 1948, Zhu Chongliang is another indispensable reference in Chinese illustration of that early generation. From the 1980s onward, Zhu Chongliang has been developing a consistent style that combines patterns, themes, and techniques issued from Chinese folklore into a visual language that speaks easily to children. There's tenderness and sweetness, yet his work is never shallow or naive. His big international breakout occurred in 2008 when his book Reunion was included in the prestigious New York Times Best Picture Book list. Reunion is an endearing story about economic migrations and about how social disparities separate families. Probably for this reason, the book was quite successful in countries like Mexico, where families are often separated by those migrations.
Since then, many of his books have been translated into different languages. So with those pioneers, illustrators started gaining visibility and make a name for themselves. This important evolution was consolidated later by a younger generation of artists. So let's move forward in time and talk about those illustrators who were born in the 1970s and started publishing in the late 2000s.
Xiangliang is probably the most iconic representative of this generation. Born in 1976 in Zhejiang, not far from Shanghai, he defines himself as a self-trained ink artist. He's often praised in China for being one of the first illustrators to write and illustrate his own stories. Many of his characters are loosely inspired in traditional stories or legends, yet his storytelling, as well as his compositions and techniques, are noticeably contemporary. He invents his own mythologies. He gives new life and meaning to traditional symbols. He hijacks traditional art forms like the Peking opera. Teor is another fine example of this intermediate generation. Trained as a sculptor, she only started publishing picture books in 2013, and the diversity shown in her work reveals her great taste for visual exploration. In a first step, her most successful titles follow the long-standing tradition of realistic illustration. Some of those sold very well in China. The Muse of Ewenki was probably the title that gained highest recognition outside of Asia. Recently, she has been dabbling in more experimental forms of illustration, and her silent books can be considered the paramount of her explorations. I particularly like this one, Mr. Black and His Dog, where she uses all the resources offered by her web pages and a handful of color shades to give light to her illustrations. You can see how the dog cleverly takes shape along the story.
This intermediate generation of illustrators develop very personal projects that don't always respond to the market expectations. Instead, I think they try to set a new course for the evolution of picture books, and for that reason, they should be a solid source of inspiration to many young artists. This takes us to talk about the new talents, the emerging talents that have arisen in great number in the past couple of years in China. Undeniably, art competitions play a great role in discovering this young crowd. This is the very objective we want to achieve with the Golden Pinwheel Young Illustrators Competition we organize at the Shanghai Book Fair. By restricting the participation to illustrators under 39 years old, and by allowing unpublished submission to be entered in the competition, we hope to become a meeting point for these upcoming talents. What strikes me most in the past 3 editions of the competition is the booming number of Chinese illustrators who show artworks of very solid artistic quality and who therefore are included in the selection of 50 finalists we make every year. It was 13 of them in the 2018 catalogue. It was 14 of them in the 2019 edition. and it was 17 Chinese artists among the 50 finalists in the 2020 selection. This prefigures that this third and new generation of contemporary illustrators will be numerous and extremely diverse. So let's look through a few pictures, and I hope to be able to share with you some of the characterizing features that I see in this new Chinese illustration.
Let's start our voyage with Guitu, who was the winner of the Golden Pinwheel competition in 2019. Born in Nanjing in 1984, Guitu is an illustrator that roots her work in a Chinese atmosphere. Surprisingly, Guitu started her working life in a very digital environment, as she was an animation designer. Yet, the 2 books she has published until now are fully analogical creations, boasting strong natural textures that give her paintings a very lively flair. The series that earned her the Golden Pinwheel Grand Award was turned into a picture book titled Big Boat. Guitu started working on this book using watercolors, but as she was experimenting for the project, she switched to oil painting. The complex palette of her illustrations result very appealing in her work and make the colors splash out of the page. It's worth mentioning that the background of the story bears a concern that appears in many young Chinese illustrators' works. In Big Boat, Guitu depicts the transformation of a small fisherman's village into a modern town, and she uses a big wave as a metaphor for a new start and the acceptance of transformation. At the end of the book, the big fisherman's boat, that symbolizes the past, sets sails for a very cheerful future. The tension between the present and the past, the disappearance of the old, the preservation of traditions are common themes among young Chinese illustrators. Likewise, the rupture of social ties and the loneliness of modern urban life also comes up very often as a recurring motif in their work. As a little game, I invite you to visit the Golden Pinwheel online gallery on the competition's website. I'm sure you'll be able to identify many works that fit into this description. The truth to be told, nostalgia and sadness are rather new elements in Chinese illustration for young readers. Cheerfulness, positivity, and harmony globally prevail as the ideal spirit to be found in children's books. But this new generation of artists are allowing themselves to use a darker language to talk about pain and melancholy. As an example of this, we could mention the early work of the 1989-born artist Rémy. Her name might sound familiar, as she was distinguished in the Biennale of Bratislava in 2015 with her very first picture book, Braids, which was translated into several languages. In the beginning, the book was object of many reservations in China, where the use of black and white and the gravity of the story, that of a little girl forced to sell her hair to support her family, made many people think the book wasn't suitable for children to read, was too dark. The international success of the book finally helped changing this perception in China, and is now recognized for the exquisiteness of its art. Later, in 2018, Rémy won the Golden Pinwheel Grand Award with a different project, now published as The Palace Cat Who Wanted Everything. The plot is loosely inspired in a Tibetan folktale, which explains the origin of the world through the artistic adventures of a palace cat. At the beginning of the earth, the palace cat decides to paint his originally grey and dull fur with all the natural pigments he can find on the mountains around him. And the result is so attractive that he's asked by all the other animals to be decorated too, giving birth to each of their distinctive furs. The illustrations were conceived using woodblock printing. It's a beautiful exercise of patience, which provides the artworks with simplicity and roughness, echoing perfectly with the ancestral times in which the story develops. Let's now have a look at the most recent winner of the Golden Pinwheel competition. Luoling is hailing from Shanghai and was born in 1981. She started her career as a graphic designer for video games, but like in Guitu's case, Her digital background is not much reflected in the style she developed later as a book illustrator. She's one of those artists who gets most of their inspiration in Chinese tales and often use Chinese traditional techniques, although she manages to give it a contemporary twist, as shows this series that was selected in the 2015 Bologna Illustrators exhibition. She won the Golden Pinwheel competition with a very simple story, though. Is there anything more universal than a mouse hunt that gets out of control and brings all kinds of disasters to the house? But her work here entails something distinctively Chinese, which shows her great knowledge of traditional arts. You can appreciate the use of rice paper, a very delicate material. And some of the color pigments used in this collage are based on ancient processes that she has studied over a 3-year-long research at the Donghuang Caves, which are home to famous mural paintings, probably the most important in the whole Buddhist world.
With all this in mind, it would be quite wrong to think that this arising generation of Chinese illustrators is trapped in their folklore or that they limit themselves to techniques used in Chinese classical traditional arts. At the same time that they are rediscovering and playing with their cultural heritage, they are very open to the world, probably more than ever. But in China, like in many other parts of the world, local identities are dissolving into one global stream of trends and styles. Chinese young people travel more and more, or at least they did when traveling was still possible. But they got to stimulate their curiosity in all the big international museums. On top of that, it's quite common to find Chinese illustrators in the art academies of Bologna, of Paris, or Cambridge. And that's because studying abroad has become extremely popular among illustrators since China still lacks training in this field. Finally, the internet and social networks are powerful tools to blur the cultural and geographical distance. They do offer a great window to explore the work of artists from all around the world. So, as a result, traveling and exploring different cultures are among the themes that we find most commonly in the submissions sent to the Golden Pinwheel competition.
The work of Uupang is clearly part of this trend. Born in northern China in 1987, she was a 3-time finalist in the Golden Pinwheel competition, and her works were also selected in Bologna for 2 consecutive years. In Cute Island, the dominance of warm and soothing colors transmit the feeling that she's at ease in this foreign environment of Korea. Characters are smiling, and everything looks light and peaceful, in spite of the black clouds that are getting closer to the shore. In A Travel, Uupang brings her alter ego, a shy little girl, into the story, and she uses a travel to Italy as a way to gain confidence in herself as she faces new challenges in this alien environment. Finally, the third series of artworks is called What Are Traditional Festivals? Uupang reviews with lightness and humor some popular celebrations from Europe. The look that someone from afar takes on our familiar reality is always interesting, as they may open us to details our eyes are not able to notice any longer. Dealing with the otherness is a way to get to know oneself. The voice of the artist is consistently reflected in those different series of artworks. Her color palette is quite characteristic, and she uses a combination of media, gouache, watercolor, colored pencil, and collage in all her pieces. Some illustrators are seasoned travelers, but it's also possible to travel far away in time and space without moving from your studio, just through imagination. I'd like to talk to you now about Zhang Fan, an illustrator hailing from the northeast region of Shandong and born in 1991. Until he won the Golden Pinwheel Grand Award in 2017 and was subsequently invited to the Bologna Children's Book Fair the year after, Zhang Fan had never left China. Yet his work is full of faraway elements in what refers to both style and contents. He won the Golden Pinwheel competition with this series called A Flower.
Placed in the context of World War II in Europe, his work plunges us in an oppressive universe made of shades of grey. Only a bright red flower, confronting the tip of a rifle, is here to symbolize the power of peace over violence. It's impossible to detect the origin of the artist when one sees this work. Looking into his earlier artworks, one will also discover Zhang Fan's fascination for Western symbology, especially that of ancient Greece, from Rome, not to forget many references to medieval architecture, references he all acquired through books. If illustration is the media chosen by many artists to rethink their past, it also allows them to imagine beyond the borders of their own reality. Illustration is about self-introspection as much as it is about evasion, in China like anywhere else. It's quite impossible to rasterize the diversity that can be found in this new Chinese illustration. The boom is palpable, though, and I have a feeling that the best is yet to come. In just a few years' time, illustrators have been improving the status of their work and gained recognition. There's still a long way to go, but it's always nice to see parents entering a bookstore and asking for a book by their favorite illustrator. Pictures now have names, and these names are a reference, a guarantee for quality. But that's not all. There's also a very interesting process of mutual recognition among young illustrators themselves. They know each other, they follow each other, they talk to each other, meet at illustration exhibitions, they exchange ideas, they explore each other's works as perpetual source of inspiration and comparison. This is a very healthy process that will surely lead to the emergence of a great collective of artists. We are proud that illustration competitions contribute to this process. As a growing number of Chinese original titles are finding their way to be translated in other languages, I really hope that you will be able to discover more of them soon in the bookstores and in the libraries of your countries. Of course, the Golden Pinwheel Online Gallery also allows you to dive into the work of all our winners and finalists, not only those from China, but also artists from other countries, including Russia, who have been trusting us and participated assiduously in the competition. I shall thank them, and I also should thank you for listening to this video.